Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm the manager of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is Emerging Impacts, the Effects of MacKenzie Scott's Large Unrestricted Gifts. This is also the title of CEP's brand new report, which we will hear about today. The report is part of a 3-year longitudinal study of the impact of MacKenzie Scott's gifts on their nonprofit recipients and their influence on the other funders. We're so glad you've joined us. First, for those of you who are tuning in and are new to CEP, I'd love to share a little bit about us. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness, and for over 2 decades, we have sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors to improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspectives of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We're a nonprofit, and we rely on grants and contributions to support our research and programs, so please reach out to us if you're interested in supporting. Our calendar for opting into a round of grantee, donor, or staff surveys in 2024 is really filling up. So please reach out also if you work at a grant maker and would like to learn more about our assessments, especially as you plan for next year. I want to say a huge thank you to the funders who supported this research: the Hilton Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rakes Foundation, Houston Endowment, Longwood Foundation, Rita Allen Foundation, Barr Foundation, Skoll Foundation, and donor Peter Brock. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we are in webinar format, which means all of you are muted and have your videos off. If you have questions for the panelists today, and we really hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel at the bottom of the screen. We will try to be as responsive as possible during the Q&A time at the end of the webinar. We will not be using the hand-raising function, as we are not asking attendees to speak their questions. If at any point you require technical assistance, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, at saed@cep.org. He can assist you. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, including all of this housekeeping information that I'm sharing right now. So feel free to check there for helpful links. If you'd like to enable closed captioning, you can do so in your Zoom control panel by clicking More and Captioning. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I have the privilege of introducing our fantastic speakers and panelists. With us today is Alicia Smith-Arriaga, the Center for Effective Philanthropy's new Vice President for Research. We also have John Palfrey, President of the MacArthur Foundation, Melanie Willingham-Jaggers, the Executive Director of GLSEN, Lakeisha Young, Founder and CEO of the Oakland Reach, and our moderator today is Phil Buchanan, the President of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Thank you again for joining us today, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Phil.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am so happy to be with all of you, and I will bring in the panel in a little bit. But first, I just want to set the stage. We've never had a webinar that so many people registered for, so thank you for that. And it just shows the level of interest there is in this very interesting sort of naturally occurring experiment. What happens when organizations receive massive gifts well beyond the typical foundation grant, for example. And before we get into that, and it is my colleague, Dr. Alicia Smith-Arriaga, our Vice President for Research, who Sarah just mentioned, who's going to actually walk us through the highlights of the research, I just want to set the stage in terms of the context a bit. We all remember, much as we probably don't really like to, March of 2020, and the weeks and months that followed, the way nonprofit organizations stepped up, reinventing themselves and becoming organizations that served meals when they hadn't done that before, or pivoting and having programs that were in person suddenly be virtual, later on becoming vaccine centers, the really heroic efforts that nonprofits made, to often small community-rooted nonprofits, to serve their communities. And it felt like we all kind of recognized and appreciated that in a different way for a moment, maybe. And then in the summer of 2020, with the racial justice reckoning, we saw different kinds of organizations and the value that they provide, from bail funds to organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative, organizations fighting against structural inequities, structural racism. And the question during that time was, okay, we see these organizations and what they're doing. What are funders going to do? Are they going to default to their standard operating procedures, or are they going to do their work differently in a moment that seemed to require a different approach? And we studied that question. Many were skeptical that funders would change, but in fact, they did. And we put out a whole slew of research reports documenting this over the last few years. We tracked this looking at self-reported change on things like streamlining processes and making unrestricted grants and engaging more deeply with issues of inequity. And we also looked at it from the nonprofit perspective, and we saw that nonprofits were and actually continue to experience funders differently than they had. Is it enough change? You know, that's a different question, but there was real change. And then MacKenzie Scott entered the scene somewhere in there around the summer of 2020 with these massive, totally unrestricted, spend it on any timeline you want gifts. And in May of 2021, I myself got the mysterious phone call informing me that the Center for Effective Philanthropy had received a large unrestricted gift. And I don't remember what I said on that phone call other than sort of reverting to some child version of myself and repeatedly saying, for real, for real. The person on the other end of the line said, yes, I am not joking. And when I informed our board about this, a couple of our board members said, well, we should study this. This is really interesting to see what happens, how these organizations utilize the resources, what effect it has. And we thought, well, are we conflicted in doing that? Well, the gift is one time, and so there's no particular reason why we would pull our punches. And we thought, well, somebody's got to study this, and we really wanted to do that. And we've done that independently of her and her advisors, just to make that clear. So the questions on our mind were, would this be, as some suggested, the ultimate demonstration of a trusting approach that would yield positive results and fuel the work of these important organizations, many of which had equity at the center of their mission? Or would it be, as many others predicted, a slow motion train wreck as organizations bowed under the pressure of these large gifts or reached a financial cliff and wouldn't be able to sustain whatever programs that they'd created? So the goal in studying this was not to suggest that others could or should give exactly as Scott had, or for that matter, that they shouldn't. It was rather to understand what any funder and also what nonprofits could learn from the experience of these organizations that received these gifts. What lessons can we take away? And that feels especially important right now in a moment of so many intense debates about how and when to trust, and the sort of odd reality of declining broad public trust in nonprofits, with many funders stepping up the level of trust. About another question was how to evaluate and learn from results, and how to most effectively pursue equity in the wake of an orchestrated backlash and the recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. So the point is, like, the stakes are high, and as we will discuss, there is a lot to learn from this early data. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Alicia Smith-Arriaga. As I do that, I want to also acknowledge our other colleagues, her colleagues and mine, Dr. Ellie Buteau, who has been involved in this project from day one, led it from the moment we launched it in early 2022, Christina M. and Emily Yang. Alicia?
Well, thanks so much, Phil. And we're super excited to share the results today of this important work. And I'm really excited, most of all, to hear both from the panel and from you about what future questions we should be asking. So before I dig into the results of the study, I did want to take a few minutes at the top of this presentation just to thank our funders who Sarah mentioned individually at the top of this call. None of this work would have been possible without the many nonprofit and foundation leaders who both volunteered their insights for the study, as well as the funders, which you see pictured here. I also wanted to take a minute to thank our amazing advisory group who volunteered their time and gave some great insights throughout this process. And really want to thank each and every person listed on this slide just for their role and their great feedback throughout. So how is MacKenzie Scott's giving different from other grant makers? Well, when you see other grant makers here on this slide, we're referring to over 10 years of grantee perception report data with thousands of nonprofits across the country. And when we compare these other grant makers' approaches to Scott's, we see 4 key differences. Scott's gifts are larger, they're unrestricted with few to no grant terms, there are few to no application or reporting requirements, and most surprisingly, there is no time limit in which the gifts must be spent. Now, given what we know about Scott's approach and how different it is, how did we design this year's study to learn even more about how this type of giving is impacting recipients? Well, in addition to adding all the new organizations to the sample that have received gifts from Scott, we also added a component to dive more deeply into funder perspectives on Scott's giving. So specifically, the 37 funders interviewed include 26 private foundations, 7 United Ways, and 4 community foundations. Now, very exciting to jump into our findings. But before I do want to note that all the findings that I'm going to present today, including this key finding 1 here, we should note that, as with any research, this data should, of course, be viewed in the context of the moment the data were collected, which is just 1 to 3 years after receipt of the gift. But even with this in mind, this research, to our knowledge, remains the most comprehensive accounting of Scott's giving and its impact. So, key finding 1. Nonprofit leaders describe expanding and improving programs to pursue opportunities, often related to equity, resulting in what they see as demonstrable impact. This quote illustrates a lot of what we were hearing from nonprofit leaders. We developed an entrepreneurial leadership camp for Black and Brown business owners, or those who are budding entrepreneurs. We're now in our 3rd year, which was going to be it for us because that was the extent of the grant dollars, but we received additional grant dollars and additional media attention. It's been very successful. Now, not only did the qualitative data point to this, but the quantitative data also support the finding that organizations are able to expand and improve programs. We see here on this slide that leaders reported they were able to use the grant to strengthen their organization's ability to achieve their mission, to innovate or take risk, and to serve communities. And we also see that the expanding and improving of programming that was happening in organizations was often in support of equity. Almost all leaders, 90%, report that their organization used some of the grant money to advance equity. And 2/3 of organizations use some of the grant money to advance racial equity explicitly. We also learned that leaders of color were slightly more likely to report that Scott's grant has or will significantly strengthen the communities in which their organizations seek to have impact. Overall, it's important to note that in this first key finding, we see that leaders of organizations that received a gift from Scott often cited the lack of restriction on when and how the money should be used as creating an opportunity to innovate on their missions in ways not previously possible. Many leaders reflected on how the unrestricted nature of the gifts allow organizations to think creatively and to create programs based on the needs of their clients. We also learned from about half of leaders that received these funds that this allowed them to develop new collaborations. Most of these collaborations were with other nonprofits, but they were also able to partner more closely with funders, government agencies, and other private businesses using their funds from Scott. Now, on to key finding 2. Nonprofit leaders describe using Scott's grants to strengthen their organization's capacity and staff climate, translating into better support for the communities their organizations serve. Almost every interviewee discussed the impact of Scott's grant on their staff. The decisions nonprofits made regarding how to use funds are resulting in what leaders describe as changes in their culture and in the daily experiences of their staff. Specifically, leaders report improved staff morale, increased creativity, and increased focus on equity internally and in their programmatic work. In fact, one leader noted, "It gave us an opportunity to dream." We also see in interviews that 2/3 of leaders of color reported that the grant gave them greater courage in their decision-making and further motivated them to advocate for those with shared backgrounds. I'll read this quote that illustrates many of the stories that we were hearing. "We were on that path to begin with, but we knew we needed to have our own house in order. If we're going to talk about equity in pay and women's empowerment, we did an internal assessment to make sure that we were walking our talk." Close to 2/3 of the nonprofit leaders we interviewed also discussed how the grant had influenced their thinking about leadership succession in their own organizations. In fact, many nonprofit leaders that we interviewed also described a wide range of equity efforts, including benchmark analyses of compensation, creating a full-blown equity and inclusion committee, and promotions of more people of color to the leadership team. Establishing or upholding pay equity surfaced continually as a priority in interviews. Now, we see in our third key finding that reactions from funders were more mixed. Although they generally expressed positive opinions about Scott's giving, many also expressed concerns about the ability of nonprofits to handle large, unrestricted gifts. We see here that the majority of funders that were interviewed reported that their thinking had been influenced by Scott. And in fact, this quote illustrates much of what we were hearing from funders about exactly how Scott influenced them. The conversations that have been happening through trust-based philanthropy, the pledge that the Ford Foundation led, as well as MacKenzie Scott's gifts have definitely been influencing the conversations we have at the foundation. I'd also say the pandemic was the catalyst. And Scott not only influenced funders, but there was also broad praise across the board for her approach to giving. However, although funders were positively influenced by Scott and her approach, more than 3/4 of interviewed funders voiced concerns about nonprofits' ability to handle these types of grants. Some of the main concerns voiced were that nonprofits who shared some of the characteristics listed here, such as being smaller or newer or having newer leaders, would be less well-positioned to handle a large unrestricted gift. Some funders, like the one illustrated here, voiced concerns that nonprofits receiving large unrestricted gifts might have difficulty in understanding the complexity of how to use that large of an infusion of cash. As this funder noted, when nonprofits get additional funding like this, it requires that they scale up internal operations and infrastructure in ways that some CEOs or executive directors and boards just weren't built to handle. Funders also voiced concerns about Scott's approach itself. About 1/4 of funders interviewed mentioned concerns about each of the topics listed here. Some spoke of concerns about the lack of transparency in Scott's process. Others perceive that organizations who have received a gift from Scott might be less likely to get funding from other organizations because of a perceived lack of need. However, the data from experiences of nonprofits stands in stark contrast to many of the concerns from funders, as we see in key finding 4. And in fact, few nonprofits reported unintended or negative consequences. The concerns funders expressed about nonprofits' ability to handle Scott's large grants are not reflected in the survey and interview data we collected from nonprofit leaders. Less than 2% of survey respondents, that's only 11 nonprofits, report having encountered any major challenge related to the receipt or use of their grant from Scott. In fact, nonprofit leaders pointed to many benefits to their fundraising efforts from having received a gift from Scott. Almost 90% of nonprofit leaders changed their approach to fundraising after receiving a gift from Scott, most frequently by using the grant as evidence of their organization's credibility. In fact, about half of survey respondents report the grant has actually made their fundraising easier. Over 40% of nonprofit leaders describe an increase in the amount of their organization's budget coming from unrestricted grants from foundations or individual donors. This quote is illustrative of how some organizations describe fundraising has become easier. We were concerned. Was this money going to deter other funders from feeling the need to fund us? And we have not really found that to be the case at all. In fact, it has given us greater standing amongst the funding community. Our funding from other funders continues to be quite strong. Most responding organizations, 80%, report that none of their foundation or individual donors have explicitly told them they are changing the funding provided because of Scott's gift. We learned so much from this year's study, and we are very much looking forward to year 3 of this study, where we will be continuing to follow the existing grantees and planning to learn more about the Yield Giving Open Call that Scott launched on March 21st of 2023. This initiative is focused on elevating organizations working with people and in places experiencing the greatest need in the United States. And if you have important research questions we should be considering for this next round of data collection, please do reach out and let us know. Before I close the presentation today, I did just want to note that Scott's giving to date has really broken the mold of typical approaches to philanthropy, even among mega donors and large foundations. While no single element of her giving is entirely new, she has put the elements together in a way that is unprecedented, making gifts that are many times the norm in terms of size, totally unrestricted with respect to use and time constraint for expenditure, and virtually free of any reporting requirements. Now, while this approach is likely to remain unusual and would not be right for every donor, it does offer opportunities for research and for learning that can inform donors at various levels, undertaking a range of different approaches. So far, the data we have gathered over the last 2 years suggests that Scott's giving continues to have profound effects on recipient organizations, and that the fears many other funders express, whether about nonprofits' ability to handle grants of this size or unintended consequences, have not materialized. We also hope you encourage others to download the full report or invite us to share these findings with your organization or other audiences. Thank you so much, and I'm super excited for the conversation today.
Alicia, thank you so much. Stay here, Alicia. Don't go away, because you're going to be a part of this conversation too. And I've never seen so many questions during a presentation. We got lots of great questions, and we'll get to some of those. So thank you to those of you who have already submitted questions. I would like to ask our panelists to join now and turn your video on, if you will. Thank you. So Melanie Willingham Jaggers, welcome. They are the executive director of GLSEN, which is a national nonprofit that works to ensure K-12 education is safe and affirming for all students, including LGBTQ plus youth. I also want to welcome Lakeisha Young, who is co-founder and CEO of the Oakland Reach, a parent-run organization founded in 2016 with the mission to make the powerless parent powerful. And finally, John Palfrey, who's president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, one of the nation's largest philanthropies with assets of approximately $7 billion. There's so much to talk about here. Like I said, there's lots of questions. And if we could put in the chat the link to the download for the report, if we haven't already, that would be great, because many of the questions are answered in the report, and others we'll get to as we talk here. But Melanie, I guess I'd love to start with you, just like thinking about the findings about the influence of these gifts on organizations' ability to expand programs, to see demonstrable impact, and also to invest in internal strengthening in pursuit of that. Does that ring true to your own experience? Tell us a little bit about how it's affected GLSEN to receive this kind of gift.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that I appreciate so much the research that you all have been doing. We've been involved. I've been involved as part of the advisory board for this research since its inception. We were part of the first round of organizations to receive big gifts from MacKenzie Scott. And I think that what is true for us, and I know, and it seems like it bears out through the research as well, is that big unrestricted gifts make big differences for organizations and thus in turn for communities. And it's so important because these big gifts do so much to both enable the organization to deliver on its mission. I can talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I think what's also true, and I think uncomfortable, is that it shifts the power dynamic, right, between organizations and our ability to do the work and those that we are asking to resource and support our work, right? We are asking our funders to meet us as we go bigger, as we dream more boldly, versus being more hand to mouth and looking to resource organizations that are likely not big enough to have the impact that we need it to be, but is contained by the size of our budget and by the size of previous gifts. So at GLSEN, we've been able to expand our reach and expand our impact when it comes to making sure that schools are more safe and affirming for young people who are LGBTQ plus identified in K-12 schools. It has also helped us understand how we need to fix, repair, build out systems within our own organization, right, that either did not exist or had become dilapidated over time. And what does it mean for us to look internally and seek to build systems of integrity through our organization so that we can create the world that we can work to create the world that we are looking to externally, while also living that life, walking that walk, as some say, inside our organization. And it's been deeply impactful. So not only were we able to survive the storm, right, that happened really in 2020. I remember the day we got the call to say that we had received this big gift. It was the moment where I said to myself, oh, wow, we are not only going to survive this moment, we get to really be thoughtful and imaginative. And I think we are required to dream big and deserve to exist in this moment. So how do we turn our eyes from survival to really thinking about how do we thrive and how do we support our community even better and advance through this? Last thing I'll say in this moment is that in a moment where I think democracy is in retreat all over the world, and particularly in this country, and where organizations like mine, who operate at the intersection of education, civil rights, LGBTQ plus justice, and youth development, when our issues are at the center of our opposition's kind of bullseye in terms of who's the target, this funding has been incredibly useful in steadying the ship as we get really crystal clear internally about what is the work that we need to do, who are the people that we need to reach out to, and how do we continue to shore up our organization internally and externally in our systems to ensure that we continue to thrive. In a moment where other funders and some corporations are losing their backbone when it comes to standing on the side of justice, this kind of gift and this kind of trust-based philanthropy is imperative to our survival, not only as an organization, but our survival and I think ability to thrive and imagine a democracy that includes all of us for the very first time.
Thank you, Melanie. That was great. Lakeisha, what's your take?
Can you repeat the question just one more time? I was so enthralled with Melanie's response.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just really, you can take it anywhere, Lakeisha, like in terms of what this meant for your organization. And did it feel, as you listened to Alicia, like your experience more or less mirrored what she was describing, or help us understand what Oakland Reach was able to do that it wouldn't have otherwise been able to do?
Yeah, so hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about a lot of stuff over these next 30 or so minutes. But I think it's important for me to start from the place of this money came at a critical time. So we had fundamentally shifted our organization as a response to the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, we were an advocacy organization experiencing a lot of success around that. We had these one-of-a-kind policy wins. But I will tell you that I was still sitting at home at night and saying, are we actually changing the conditions in the communities and the folks that we care about? And the answer I came back with was no. I felt like our policy and advocacy work was just not getting to the folks we needed to get to. And so when the pandemic hit, we took it as an opportunity to pivot, and we built the model of excellence that we had been advocating for our systems to adopt. And that was called our virtual hub. And in that virtual hub, we saw literacy outcome gains with our kids that our schools had never delivered on, right? And this is before we got on the radar of MacKenzie Scott, but that's exactly why we got on the radar of MacKenzie Scott. So you are going to hear me talk a lot about how critical leadership is and trust and how that goes. But I had changed as a leader around the work we were doing, which put us on the pathway to be on the radar for MacKenzie Scott. So we received that email in October of the year of October 2021. And I know people may be interested in wondering, like, how does this all happen? So I think hopefully through this conversation, we can give people a window into like how this happens. So we get this anonymous email in October of 2021 after having a successful phase 1 pilot of our hub going into phase 2. And we only know it as an anonymous donor, right? And we know this as an anonymous donor. And hey, we want to do this due diligence. The reason why I really bring this up is because I want to talk more obviously later around how critical that due diligence was as a leader, right? In making those donations for us. But what MacKenzie's gift did was it gave us some ease that we can continue to go bold for our communities, right? We had changed who we were as an organization without necessarily verbally saying we have made an identity shift. We were experimenting with a whole new different way of serving our communities. We were doing it better. And we were going to have to be bringing our funding community along, who were seeing us as like a policy advocacy org. And now we're moving to being a solutions builder, right? And we're loving it, right? And so her dollars were saying, I affirm that you're on the right track, right? And keep going, because you can start a thing, but you also need to figure out how you sustain and grow that thing over time. So keep going. And it was exactly what we needed, because our organization never gets too far ahead of our families and the people we serve. So when our families went back to school, that solution that we built no longer was the right solution. But because we had changed our business into being solutions builders and building models, we had the DNA now to then extract what was really amazing about the virtual hub and move it into the new model, which we now call the Liberator model, that upskills parents and caregivers to be literacy and math tutors. So when you ask Phil about what that gift did, It was affirming around the impact. It was saying, don't be afraid, keep going. You're on to something. And you don't always get that. It's like, hey, you're on to something, keep going, do 5 more iterations, and then we can check in, right? And this is how we landed at where we are. And we have now been able to so comfortably redefine our identity as not a parent advocacy org, but as solutions builders, right? Building models that liberate our communities to build a life of their own design. That is what MacKenzie's money allowed us to sort of evolve into.
Thank you so much. And before I bring in John, I promise I will bring you in, but real quick, Melanie and Lakeisha, one of the things that I see in the Q&A and some of the questions that are coming in is a really sincere question, I think. Well, there's a range of ways it gets expressed. That's along the lines of, yes, this was important for your organization, and CEP is studying the perspectives of the organizational leaders. But how confident are you that it's really making a difference for the most important people, the people you serve? I just want to give you a chance to, and folks might say, well, of course they're going to say they're confident, but you know, truth serum here, like how confident do you feel that this is translating over time into greater impact against your goals?
I'm happy to start here. I feel so excited about how we've been able to clarify our vision with exactly that question at the heart. How are we putting young people at the core of what we do? How are we making sure that we are preparing young people to be full, connected participants in our democracy, to build for the first time a democracy that includes us all in the next generation? How are we building a school system that is preparing these young people, right? How are we helping to transform that system in a way that best serves our young people, regardless of their need, right? Those are the questions at the core of any thinking that we do about who we are, what we do, or what's next. And it's this kind of gift, it's this kind of trust-based philanthropy, it's this kind of big money that frees us up, organizations like mine and many others, to think big, to think impactful, to think at the level of scale. And I think that what's important here, and just to reiterate, I think a point I made earlier, is that, you know, we all understand as individual workers, as individuals in the world, how important it is to just be able to rest at some point. And there's a clarity that comes to your mind when you're able just to kind of get off your feet, maybe chill a little bit, take a couple deep breaths, and not have to keep running for your life, right? This kind of big gift had that impact on our organization. We didn't sit down and kick our feet up. We got to work, but we got to work in a way that we understood there was no financial cliff we were running from. We didn't have to, do a bigger, more intricate song and dance show to say, hey, we really should survive, help us get through this pandemic. We were really able to think together and broadly about what we needed, who we needed to be for the young people who need us most. So that's part one. And I think part two is that it's so important that we understand success as more than just a bottom line, right? Success is building an organization that is going to be, that's deeply reflective of the values that they propose to push forward. It's both being effective in mission, but it's also being a good employer. So when we're talking about, I think when we're talking about our work, it's important to trust the folks who are doing the work, to know what they are doing, and to free them up to think boldly and expansively about what success looks like. And I think being in relationship and being in conversation with us and across these lines of power and lines of our field is super important. So I'm really happy for this kind of conversation. But there's a level of trust here that really is around who are the people doing the work, what has their track record been, what happens if we put some Miracle Grow on them and see what happens, and then we iterate from there. And that's the solution that I think is most readily found, I think, by these big gifts.
Yeah, that's great. And you're illustrating, the link. You can't separate the internal strengthening from the external impact. Lakeisha, anything you would add?
Yeah, I think the tail end of what Melanie said, I think resonates most to the response I'm going to give, which is like, I'm only as confident that this money will deliver on what we want to as my leadership delivers on what we need to deliver. You're going to hear me talk about leadership and trust. This is not the first time that Reach has received trust-based philanthropy. So I want to be clear on that, right? When we first started, someone invested in us on a dream and a metrics table, right? And it was my responsibility to deliver on that so that other funders could also become interested and add on and add on. So there is this sort of interesting relationship and tension between leadership and trust. My trust, I need to earn trust as a leader, right? So I want to be invested in, I need to be invested in, but I have the audacity to say that I want to make the lives of Black people and Black kids in my communities better in ways that we can touch, feel, smell, and see. And I love that I've signed up for that, but that is not a small feat. So you need to trust me to the point of me delivering on that. So I want to really like pull on this sort of trust without accountability piece. No, 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 no. You trust me and I need to show up around that trust. And you heard me say in my previous responses that what put us on McKenzie's radar was that we had shifted our work and our model into one that was having greater impact, which then created a different level of trust. So just that's the visual is leadership and my growth around leadership and what I'm delivering on leadership earns me more trust, right? Somebody is going to take a risk on you early on. Few funders may take a risk on you early on, but like money is not a miracle pill, right? You can give me all the money in the world, and that doesn't mean I'm going to deliver on what I need to deliver on. And that's what I hold myself accountable to every single day. It's actually that focus that brings in the resources. That's what changed us as an organization. That's what put us on her radar. So my simple question response, going backfield to what you originally asked was, I'm only as confident that this money will work at the extent that my leadership keeps growing and evolving and focusing on that impact. If not, then no.
Yeah. Yeah. And this sort of sense of not taking this responsibility lightly really comes through in the interviews that we did. Melody, did you have a quick thing before I bring John in, who's been so patient?
I just want to say one thing that Lakeisha really brought alive for me is this relationship between trust and accountability. We've been talking a lot about trust. Funders, I think, are struggling with trust. But Lakeisha's point, I just want to underline it and lift it up and wave it around a little bit, which is that, you know, there's two parts of this equation, right? There's a trust that folks, that philanthropy, individuals and institutions and corporations have in organizations like ours. And then there's the accountability that our organizations have to the people that we exist to be in service and community with and for, right? We are not, you know, like going away from who we are, who our people are, where our communities are, going into some other place that doesn't know us and that we don't know to do some work. We are literally in relationship with and accountable to the people who we serve. And so, yes, trust-based philanthropy is deeply important because, and it's not about a lack of accountability. It might be a lack of accountability to funders in a particular kind of way, but that's where the trust comes in, right? Because our accountability is first and foremost and deeply rooted in accountability to our communities, right? And accountability to our constituents. And so as we are talking about trust-based philanthropy and, you know, how the systems and processes might shift, I just want to lift up that there's not a lack of accountability. There's deep accountability, but that trust from philanthropy really underscores the belief in our accountability to our communities and the trust from you all to us and ability to lead the work and break new ground.
Thank you. So John, you lead a foundation. Does what you heard today influence your thinking as a foundation leader? Does what you've seen MacKenzie Scott do influence you, or is it not so relevant?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And Phil, thank you for not bringing me in off the bat. Of course, I'm sure we can all agree that Lakeisha and Melanie are much better to listen to than I am. And I'm super inspired by what they've said about the gift. And congratulations to all three of you for receiving this important and well-earned reward. And Alicia, great survey, really fantastic findings. And I think that if we all had the round of applause thing, we would do it. I don't actually see it in my little participant thing, but in any event, congratulations all around. And for sure, I mean, I would put myself in the category of a funder and that 70% who are influenced for sure by MacKenzie Scott's work. I mean, I think if anybody is in a field where somebody does something so bold, so focused on social and racial justice, so deeply committed to changing a field, we have to pay attention. It would be malpractice not to, in my view, for philanthropy. It builds upon some of the things MacArthur does anyway. I would highlight our fellows program, which for 40 years has been giving unrestricted, completely trusting, grants to incredible people, very diverse crew every year, $800,000, no reporting. They get a phone call like you did out of the blue. It's a fun thing to do. We're going to keep doing it. And that, to my mind, is absolutely, the findings are encouraging. Not that we needed more encouragement through the MacArthur Fellowship, but, that's certainly directionally the same way. I also have a conversation every day within MacArthur, every time someone is bringing grants forward to say, could this be Gen Up? Right? Is there any reason this has to be project funding? Now, sometimes it does, within a intermediary sometimes have to be restricted in some way, right? Or universities, sometimes you have to send it to program. But basically, if we trust the person enough to give them the money, why are we putting constraints on it? What is the reason to do that? That is a question that every program officer has to answer to me every time, because I really do think that the way that Melanie and Lakeisha described it, which is if you're going to do trust-based philanthropy and you have someone that you believe will be accountable both ways, which is exactly the right point, and going to do great work, then give it to them. And that's the whole point, is invest in the people that you believe are going to do it. So I absolutely believe that. There are lots of other takeaways, but let me just pause there.
And let's transition, since we're talking about how you make sense of this, to the folks in the funder community who expressed a lot of, maybe many of them expressed both praise and also concern that organizations might not be able to handle these gifts. And I'll just be honest, lay my cards on the table, and I think Alicia felt the same way. I don't want to speak for you, but some of the interview transcripts, kind of took me aback a bit in terms of the skepticism about organizations' ability to handle this kind of grant. John, what did you make of that?
Probably found it as puzzling as Lakeisha and Melanie and you did. I mean, it's a bizarre argument. I've heard it in the past as a board chair of other foundations, as a president now. I think it's not right. And I was actually surprised as many people were willing to tell you that, at least somewhat on the record. So I think it is, however, and I think it's one of the great strengths of CEP is you do hold up mirrors to us as organizations. It's why we do the survey with you periodically, and I think are doing it again this coming year. I'm now reminded by Sarah that if we haven't asked for that, we probably should. It's very helpful, but it also holds up a mirror on the sector, right? And it says, okay, so we may think that we're, really moving in this great racial justice, trust-based way, and actually a lot of us aren't, right? And especially for those philanthropies that feel that we are doing that, it's to say we're not doing enough, right? Or we need to convince our peers or whatever else. But I see really no merit to that argument.
It's interesting because we get what I think probably in MacArthur land is like a modest grant from the MacArthur Foundation at CEP. And I knew things were actually really changing sort of broadly. When did you start again, John?
Sorry, I muted myself. I started 2019.
Yeah, so you came in just before all this, and you obviously decided to make some change in response to the pandemic. And I remember being really pleasantly surprised when our program officer said, hey, instead of a report, it might have been even instead of a proposal, let's just have a conversation.
Absolutely.
And I was like, what? With the MacArthur Foundation, which I viewed as a pretty traditional funder in the past. And that might seem like a little thing, but it's actually a big thing when you add up, the time, right? And so when we've looked at the nonprofit experience before and after the pandemic, folks are actually spending less time on processes, and it translates into a lot of time. Was that hard to push that kind of change? Because sometimes people say, well, okay, if you've got a fresh slate, like MacKenzie Scott did, okay, you can do it really differently. But if you're walking in to an institution that has a lot of processes and legal counsel and everything else, was that hard to make that change?
Not so much, I will say, for a couple of reasons. The pandemic was a terrible thing, and the deaths were very real, and the death of Mr. Floyd was, a complete tragedy. It did, for sure, allow people to break some things that were not working and to recreate something better in a number of ways. And I think for any of us who was in a position to have that reevaluation, I talked about it as deconstruction and reconstruction, of the good sort, hopefully, of what we're doing. And it did lead to us, where we can, we do a general operating grant with no application. We call it Gen Op, no app. We allow people to, to give reports, as you said, and so forth. There are lots of things that we can do, and we were able to try. The world did not end when we did it. It does, there are trade-offs with everything, of course. I will say it put more work on our staff, right?
Right.
So staff, okay, so we can hire more staff, or we can collect less. We should have a general, I think there are lots of other things. I really think we should have a common app for philanthropy where you put in the data once and we just pull what we need, right? We're working on that too. And if we have to hire more people and we have a higher administrative burden, but it puts less burden on the people like Melanie, like Lakeisha, who are doing the work, let's do it. Like, okay, fine, it might go with a higher percentage and someone will be critical of us, but if it actually means the work is being done better because more of the work is done on the MacArthur side, then that's a good thing. So anyway, of course there are pushbacks and there are trade-offs, but I think directionally, and that's my bottom line, directionally, this was a really, really important thing that MacKenzie Scott has done and is doing.
Thank you. And we've got about 20 minutes left. And in a minute, I want to come to
Well, can
Alicia.
we respond to that as well, though?
Yeah, of course you can.
Because honestly, I think there is some truth to that. I know it's kind of like, how can they say that? But I do believe that there's some truth to what they're saying. I just think that funders have to take responsibility around that being true, right? And the
What
point
is
I'm
that, Lakeisha, just so we're really tracking
when
it.
you posed the question to John around funders having concerns around organizations like Melanie and
Oh, yeah.
ours having a lot of money, there are two important points I do want to make to that. First, before I go back to the point I was going to make, first point is that MacKenzie, I believe, made a calculated stretch gift to us. So when we changed our model between May of 2021 and October 2022, Reach brought in more revenue from all of our underfunders who trusted what we were building than we ever had. And that was right around the time MacKenzie came in. And one of the questions that they asked us during the due diligence is that if you could back of the envelope, write a number of what you need for the next 3 years, what would that number be? We were ultimately rewarded a third of that number. So between our ask and their financial due diligence, they made a stretch on us that we had never experienced before, but it wasn't like driving off a cliff into like the seas of whatever, right? Like, so I just want to make that clear for folks and help people understand that they did. I mean, it's just great to have anybody. Melanie probably went through this too. What do you need? But what I say I need and what I can handle are not always in the same. So they took a calculated stretch. So if there's anything I would push funders to do on that first comment is, how do you take stretches? So like, although I enjoy and love my funder relationships, I'm pushing my funders now around, are your renewals making the stretches that they need to make based on the impact that we're doing? And now we get to have a different conversation. The second portion about their concerns that I believe have truth to them about whether or not we can handle, groups like ours can handle those gifts, I think have a lot to do with what I was saying before around leadership and trust, which is I have talked to funders, right? Especially as we've built our model, and our model is very replicable and connected to other communities. I've heard funders say, hey, we just want to give the money and trust that these communities can figure it out. And then 18 months later, they're not seeing results. And then they sigh and they grumble. And now the trust is being eroded, right?
Mhm.
Because your trust-based philanthropy didn't have the right accountability, didn't have the right. I can have the audacity to want to build an organization, but do I know how to plan? Do I know what outcomes are different from inputs, right? These are a lot of things that leaders who have great dreams and great care, they don't know about. And so while boards can play a role in it, funders can play a tremendous role in building up leadership capacity that keeps trust intact. And that's where I was saying that their comment is not, it has truth to it. It's just that they need to take responsibility for sort of adding, for perpetuating that sense of distrust. It comes from not necessarily providing the right level of capacity building and accountability that's needed across my leadership journey, so that you're not like, oh God, it's 18 months, what happened? It's 24 months, what happened? So I've
Right,
seen this
right.
happen up close and personal as I'm 7 years in. So that's just the only other insight that I wanted to add to that finding. It's not
Right.
all like clutch your pearls, right?
Right.
Some
And
of
it's
this
look,
is,
it's thanks, Lakeisha. Like, you know, and it's as Alicia says every time she presents us, it's like early days, right? But it is striking, and Melanie, I'll bring you in on this point, that the funder concerns do not seem to be borne out so far in any way, shape, or form by the data that we've gathered. And we've gathered a lot of data, and you can say, well, it's from the organizations, but no reason to believe that they're not honest and truthful in what they're saying. So Melanie, what's your take on this kind of disconnect between some of the funder concerns about the terrible things that are going to happen and what we're seeing so far? Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm going to tell you where I think it comes from. Here's what I'll tell you.
Okay.
I do think that, you know, to learn, I think the concerns around like, this is too much money. You're going to blow it all in one place. You're going to grow too big. You're going to, you know, spurt up and then flop over. Totally hear it. And I think that maybe I will answer your question. I think part of that comes from a desire to like not see, you know, organizations who have been around for a long time or organizations who are new burn out. I get it. Appreciate it. Also, what is also true about all living things is that learning takes experience. And so it's actually not okay for our organizations to be small and doing the same thing that we've been doing over time. My organization was founded in 1990. I'm just the third leader of this organization. We are in a moment that is more similar to the moment of our founding than any moment in the last 20 years, right? Why we exist, for whom we exist, and what our work is. And if that's the case, which I think it is, then we actually cannot afford to continue to operate in the same way that we have over the last 34 years. We have to be attentive to this moment. And I think that us learning and succeeding sometimes and not succeeding, failing, is all par for the course. And organizations who are accountable to communities, who are looking to move and shape and shift the world, have to be able to, and the people who lead those organizations have to be able to learn and grow and succeed and fail as we attempt to find our pathway to freedom, right? That is the point. For us to be required to be perfect at every turn or to know things that there's no way we could know how to do if we have never had the opportunity to do it is not, it's the opposite of trust-based philanthropy. It's also pretty disrespectful, right? We have to actually be able to be both human and accountable and at the cutting edge of providing our communities with what we have long needed, but have not received.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to, if I can sort of step out of the moderator role for a second and insert one point that Alicia and I have talked about a lot. The fact that there's no time deadline on when this money has to be spent is unlike any other grant that I've ever received, pretty much, right? Like, I can't think of a meaningfully sized grant that's longer than 3 years that CEP has ever received, right? So the fact that leaders have the freedom to plan in that way is, of course, why they're not so worried about the financial cliff. And why do we default, you know, to 3-year grants or as the long grant, right? You know, so it's an interesting question. But I want to turn to something else. Alicia, there's some questions from participants about essentially as a researcher, how long do you think we should be tracking this? Like our study is a 3-year study. It's a 3-year study because we were able to raise money for a 3-year study. But what do you think would make sense in terms of how long you track what happens to these organizations? Would you want to go back at year 5, year 10?
Yeah, Phil, I mean, the point you're making is correct, right? Like we are doing a 3-year study because, that's the funding we've received to this point. But really, we all know, especially given that the next round of gifts will happen in March of next year, 6 to 12 months after that is really not a significant enough amount of time to really understand for all the organizations who receive these gifts and all the different iterations of giving, what were the implications of that for organizations and for communities. And I think especially for a lot of the folks who were asking the questions earlier around what are the impacts on communities, we all know we need more time to see. And so I would say, whether it's 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, definitely having more data is more information, which is a more powerful story to tell about what these gifts can do when leaders are empowered with these kinds of funds.
And another question that's come up, and I wonder what your take on this is, and this is something we always get because not everybody responds to a survey. How worried are you about representativeness, about non-responder bias, about maybe we just got the happy stories?
Well, I would say that we conducted analysis of the organizations who didn't respond and those who did and compared them. And the only major difference is that there are like a few major differences around international organizations versus domestic. But other than that, generally the characteristics are the same of the respondents and non-respondents to the extent that we can measure. The other thing I would say is this is not the end. So if you're on this webinar or folks who've gotten a gift from MacKenzie Scott, and if you could say to them or to yourself, hey, if I have an email from CEP in my inbox, please do respond. Because that will only help make the data richer and even more representative.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that has struck me is the tendency, maybe it's just in every field, but in philanthropy, to position things as a binary. So I was on Zoom as like a guest speaker at a business school class, and they were talking about philanthropy, and the professor put up a slide that said it was like a continuum, trust-based versus strategic. And MacKenzie Scott, strategic and impact-oriented. MacKenzie Scott was on the trust-based side, and like Bill Gates was on the impact side. And I thought, boy, this is a real shame to think of it this way, right? Because what I hear in the panelists' comments is an argument that the trust enables the impact and that this approach can actually be strategic. I wonder if each of you could comment on that. And like, if you agree with what I'm saying, great. If you don't, great. But if you do, how do we get funders to think about that a bit differently and not to think of it as a binary? John, you want to start on that one?
Sure. I mean, Phil, as always, you give us a lot to think about. And I'll be interested in what a better slider might look like of that sort. A couple of things I agree with. I agree that a portfolio approach makes sense. So back to MacArthur, we do the fellows program, which I think is a model of trust-based. We don't do everything the way MacKenzie Scott does for a number of reasons. One is so that people can approach us and have discussions, and we are obviously more transparent on our website about how we do things and so forth, right? As MacArthur, so we do things in a different way. But I love your point, not pitting trust-based against impact. That doesn't make any sense, because I do think the most impactful things we've done probably have been, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Manuel Miranda getting, fellowships from MacArthur may have helped some cool stuff that they like. I don't know. That seems like pretty good impact. Like we could go down the list. So that's a really, really important insight that I will be thinking about after this.
Great.
I mean, I would give a simple response to say that that viewpoint doesn't really change what I need to do every day as a leader. It's obviously a conversation, right? That's being had around trust-based versus impact. Like what that means for me is kind of unclear, right? I do believe that, trusting me drives me to feel confident that I can keep going ahead and making impact. And I think they are connected. But again, I will always just go back to like, it is the responsibility of me as a leader to also earn that trust and to also show that impact. And so because what I hear you saying, Phil, a little bit is kind of like in the funder space, right? There's sort of a conversation around like pitting against like trust and impact and pitting those two together. And I'm just trying to translate it to folks like us who are on the ground moving the work.
Right.
And I think that would be the question of like, what does that pitting, what should that mean to me?
Right. Right.
And
I'm
how
saying,
we're funded or giving the resources to move the work forward.
yeah,
I love philosophical debates. It's okay, right? Like, let's do it. But then when it becomes operational to what I do, then I'm more curious of like, how should I be thinking about my work differently if this is the larger conversation? That's why I love hearing this, because these are tables that we're not at right now.
yeah, yeah. And I think what I was trying to say, Lakeisha, and like you've demonstrated it so powerfully in this conversation, is that everybody wants impact, right? Like nonprofit leaders are not in this role for any other reason. And you obviously take that so seriously, and this has been so helpful, this funding in that pursuit. And yet somehow, not just in that business school class, but in funder conversations, it gets positioned as a kind of a false binary is what I was suggesting. And I think that's unfortunate. And the other thing that happens, to John's point, is I think people don't take the context into consideration enough. What works as a philanthropic approach in one context might not make sense in another. But Melanie, what do you think? And do you see that with funders that you are chatting with, or how do we shift that?
I think that dichotomy is so deeply unfortunate. And, leave it to the LGBTQ plus community to help us all understand that binaries are a myth, right? And that we are actually on, off, beyond, between every place, and that binaries are falsehoods. It's always both and, it's never either or. So that's part one. Part two, I would offer that, I think that what makes me sad, or what kind of speaks to a part of me, the part of me that this speaks to, makes me sad because it really reeks of paternalism, right? The idea that because you've got the money, because someone has money and position, they actually know better, or they matter more than someone in a different position with different relationships to money or position. And I don't think that that's actually the intention, right? I do think that the intention is to ask the hard-hitting question, but I do want to remind the folks with the money and the position how it sounds and what it conveys to people and organizations who are doing work every day, employing folks all over this country to make local impact and to shift and improve the material conditions of people in this world who don't actually have enough, right? Who are working real hard to make sure that we're doing it right. And when we aren't doing it right, we need to be held accountable and need to be in an accountable relationship and make sure that we are improving. But the idea that it's either about trust or about impact, to me, centers those with position and money as the most important person to feel good in this equation, or the person or the entity that needs to feel the most impact or see the most results, versus the folks who are on the in the actual equation in communities in those conditions that folks like me and like Lakeisha are working to shift.
Thank you, Melanie. That's great. And I also want to recommend a blog post that just came out on our blog today by Pam Foster at Co-Impact that also takes on some of these issues in the way that Melanie and Lakeisha were just discussing. I think it's a great piece. So maybe we can put that in the chat as well. Okay, we're going to close out now, and I'm going to give you each just 30 seconds for one thought that you want to leave folks with. I'll give you a second to think about it. I'm going to go Melanie, John, Lakeisha, Alicia. 30 seconds, one thing you want this audience, which is largely funders, there's nonprofit leaders, but largely funders to leave with. Melanie?
I would say thank you for your curiosity of being in this conversation. I'd say that, you know, we are accountable to those we are in relationship with. And so being in the relationship between nonprofit leaders and nonprofit staff and to our communities and also to our funders is deeply important. And so I'm hoping that this study, this conversation opens the door to deepen relationships and to deepen mutual accountability. The final thing I would say is that in a moment of seismic shifts in our world, in our country, in our economy, in the planet, we have to do things differently. And what we have done has gotten us here. So let us think together about what we actually need to do moving forward to get to a different place, one where everyone has dignity and every one of us who have needs, we all have needs, have what we need. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Melanie. John?
So well said, Melanie. You basically said all the things I would have. So I'll say them more briefly. Phil, you asked, was it hard to make certain changes? And I would say one of the things is exactly what Melanie said, which is if you have frustration, which we should, about where we are, you have to recognize that it is what we've been doing that has gotten us here. So we need to change it, right? And that is actually, I think with change makers, people in philanthropy and nonprofits, that should be a short conversation, right? If we were doing the status quo, do something else, right? Anyway, that is number one. My takeaway, though, from this conversation really is Melanie and Lakeisha both leaning in so hard to the two-way trust and two-way accountability associated with these gifts. And I think too often when it's presented to funders or by funders, it's like, oh no, nonprofits just want us to trust them, give them the money and go away, and we shouldn't actually have any jobs. And in fact, what I'm hearing so clearly, and of course, I've heard from great grantees as well in other settings, but I think more powerfully put today than I've ever heard it before, is that the whole idea is a two-way one. And the reason that Melanie and Lakeisha and all of you get up every day is to make a difference, and you want to be accountable and so forth. And in fact, it allows that work to be done better and with more impact, not less.
Thank you so much. And we have very little time, but Lakeisha and Alicia, I don't want to leave you out. So what's your take, Lakeisha?
I'll try to go as quick as possible. I want to end with the folks I serve, right? So at least over 80% of Black students in Oakland are not proficient in reading, okay? Even less in math. The wealth gap between Black households and white households is worse than we've ever seen. I think it's about 17,000 with Black folks and 180 something thousand with white people. And the reason why I bring that up is because this is why I get up every day and do this work. We need balance. So I want you to hold me accountable for doing something in 3 years, because just imagine what just happened in 30 and 50 years and what's going to continue to happen. We need that urgency. So yes, and so that's what I will push funders on, which is give us the kind of stretch dollars that allow us to do that work and be nimble to solve such a deep gap that Melanie and I were born into. It was bad when my grandparents were alive, and it's even worse now. Have such a bigger thing to address. But please be my partner and please hold me accountable to get results in a shorter amount of time, because we can take as much time as we want. The problems of our society are moving at their own pace, and our work needs to keep up with that and get ahead of it, hopefully at some point. And that's it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Alicia, what would you like to leave people with? And thank you again for all your work on this.
Yes, I mean, this has just been an amazing conversation. I just want to thank everybody for participating. And I would just say that, this is just year 2, and there is so much more work to be done. So I'd love to hear from folks what other questions you would like to see answered, because this research is only as powerful as we're answering the questions that really serve the field.
Perfect. Thank you. Do be in touch with us. I appreciate that, Alicia. Thanks to you again, to you, Lakeisha, to you, Melanie, and to you, John. I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah with like 20 seconds of farewell. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was so great, and already had several attendees wanting more and more time. So thank you all for coming today. wanted to shout out that there should be a survey already in your inbox. It would mean so much to us if you'd fill it out. It will take 2 minutes. It really helps us keep improving these programs and answering the good questions that you all have. So thank you very much, and we will see you at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.